Oh, thanks, Dave, and thanks for having me, everyone. So I'm Ruth. My day job is running a business called Octopus Money that is setting out to solve the advice gap. But I also have the pleasure of being chair of Seckle. So I'm its biggest cheerleader while being able to take no responsibility for everything it's achieved. So I thought I'd talk to you a bit about the tipping point. Now, I moved over from retail banking into wealth management about 5 years ago and spent the first 4 years of my time at Octopus running Octopus Investments before moving over to run Octopus Money. But what I found working in retail banking and fintech in the time I did was there was a tipping point. And this is Gladwell's definition of a tipping point. It's a less exciting way of describing it than the dancing man at the beginning that rather stole my thunder. But it's a moment of small influence that creates this rapid and sudden change. So I was trying to think about what are the tipping points we see in our everyday life. Now, I don't see very many beards in this room, which is really disappointing, because I had that as a nailed-on tipping point, that there was a time when you'd comment on someone's beard and that time has passed. Now it's just a thing. It's all right to have a beard. And there's some others, there aren't that many women in the room, but crop tops, when did we start having to show our stomachs again? That was a thing that happened in the 90s and is now back. Passive funds, I'm just trying to be controversial. I'm not necessarily saying that we've reached that tipping point. But there's all sorts of things. There's social movements. There's things like Black Lives Matter. There's things like the riots we've seen recently, where there's a societal change that happens. And some of these you think, okay, these are going to persist. These are going to create an ongoing change, and others that will ebb and flow. And I think one of the talents that you need actually running a business now is to figure out which changes are going to persist and which might ebb and flow. So the biggest one I saw when I was working in money was this one. So cast your mind back 10 years. So 2014, Nicola Sturgeon had just taken over running the S&P for our Scottish colleagues. There was that lovely poppy display in the Tower of London. Oh, was my mic just stopped working? Is that just me? Can you still hear me? Yeah, good. There was that massive poppy display in the Tower of London, which was beautiful. George Clooney got married. That happened in 2014. So he Pharrell Williams was number one with Happy. So if you cast yourself back, I was working in an incredibly grotty shared office space in King's Cross, starting a retail bank. And we spent a lot of time debating, could you build a retail bank without accepting checks? No one had really done it. Every bank at that point accepted checks. Now, hands up, who's written a check in the last year? No one, literally no one. 5% of the UK wrote a check last year. So you are incredibly unusual. Maybe you're just keeping your hand down because you're in a room full of financial services people and you're too embarrassed. 55% of people wrote a check in the last year. There you see. But the tipping point, interestingly, was not about did people still need to write a check? It was would they accept banking with a bank that didn't offer checks? So there's a nuance on actually where that tipping point came. And now if you say, would you bank with a bank that didn't accept checks? I suspect everyone, given you don't write checks, definitely, I suspect everyone would say yes. But we, even sitting there at that moment when everyone could see lots of change happening, we couldn't figure out when that tipping point would be. And it happened probably within a year of us having all those conversations. By 2015, it was pretty well established that you could get away with that. So this is what the new banking landscape looked like at that point. Only Metro had got a new banking license in the last 100 years, a new retail banking license, which is astonishing. And you had the Treasury and the regulator saying, we need more competition in this space. Customers aren't getting good outcomes. We need more competition. And yet everyone in their big bank boardrooms was looking at the Metro strategy and going, branch-based, dog bowls, roller boots, this is never going to work. This is never going to compete with us. We're really safe. They just don't get how hard acquiring new customers is. You're more likely to get divorced than change your bank account. So everyone was feeling pretty comfortable sitting with their millions of customers that they weren't going to get challenged. 10 years on, Monzo has 10 million customers. Monzo was started at about this time. So that tipping point was happening and people just didn't acknowledge that it was coming. Now, when I was in that space, I noticed 3 strategies that businesses deployed. And I think this is the interesting read across actually into wealth. So the first thing that happened was people picked off the profitable bits of business. They might have been the profitable bits, they might have been the easy bit, but the really obvious example in retail banking was remittances, so sending money overseas. Banks charged loads of money for it. They weren't particularly good at it. And a load of fintechs came in and said, I can do that. I can generate a good margin because banks were making a huge amount of margin on remittances. I can do it more cheaply. I can build a new tech stack. I can deliver a different customer experience. And fundamentally, I can charge for it differently. So you went from banks charging a big fee to fintechs actually playing around with FX in the background. So they were still making a nice margin, but the customer got used to a different charging model for it. So suddenly they flocked over to the Revoluts, to the World Remits, to the Wises of this world, and banks lost that business. And actually that was really, really bad for their P&Ls. But customers were really satisfied. And again, people were sitting there going, but people want everything in one place. Remittances for me was the moment that we proved that wasn't true. Second thing is people said, well, I can challenge these big players, actually. They don't have a moat around them. I can try and do the same. Now, building in retail banking is quite different from building in wealth. So the received wisdom in retail banking is really hard, but you can acquire customer by customer because people are transacting, they're interacting with their account every day. In wealth, it's very different. You know, a lot of people say you can't rush a wealth business. But then look over the last 5 years, we've got a different strategy for building big businesses, which is consolidating existing businesses. And you see more change probably over the last 5 years in wealth than I would say you saw in the previous 10 to 15. So you see people challenging the big players, absolutely, in the wealth space. And then the final bit, which I think is also really interesting, is there'd been a received wisdom at that time of, I can build it myself. It needs to be proprietary. I'm not going to have a brilliant customer experience unless I own the whole stack. And then suddenly those people who were building different bits started saying to the big players, well, I can do some of this better than you. And actually the smart ones said, you are absolutely right. I'm going to buy this KYC tool from you rather than imagine that KYC is the thing that's going to differentiate my business. So the really smart banks started actually to think more about microservices and start to think, well, where can I plug in best of breed rather than imagine that everything is going to get through my product roadmap. And this is what you got. So, you know, was competition in banking a success? I think absolutely. Customers get dramatically better outcomes now than I think they did 10 years ago. Did that mean every startup was a success? Absolutely not. It's really hard to scale a business in the fintech or retail banking space. But what new entrants do is they put pressure on the incumbents to raise their game. And what the smart incumbents did was they looked to those new entrants and thought, how do we steal what they're doing and accelerate really quickly? So are we at that tipping point in wealth? Are we going to see the acceleration in innovation in wealth over the next 5 years that we saw in retail banking and fintech during that period? So who's seen a fee-free investment platform advertised recently? Anyone? I see one almost every day. Fee-free. It's like the remittances space. You know, they're taking an existing model and they're saying, we're probably going to keep the interest on cash. And, you know, we're going to get away with that for as long as we can. We're not going to charge people. And customers go, oh, sounds better. I'm not getting charged for investing. Picking off the bits that they can do profitably that customers want, that customers will take. Who's had an AI-enabled efficiency tool pitched to them in the last day? Yeah? That's the same strategy. It's the Onfido strategy of I can help you run a more efficient business. So I think we're at that really interesting point where, you know, all of you, whatever your role is in a business, you've got a choice. Is you're like the guy in the big bank boardroom, because it probably was a guy then, who said, oh, we've got a great moat around our business. We've got loads of customers. We're fine. There's more customers than anyone knows what to do with. Absolutely true in wealth, more true in wealth than it ever was in retail banking. Or you get to be the person that says, I'm going to look around and I think we're getting towards a tipping point. I'm never going to predict where it is, just as you're never going to predict the market. But I can predict that that tipping point is coming. And my way to get ahead of that actually is to look out into the market and go, I'm going to pick off the best bits of what everyone else is doing and bring it into my business completely unapologetically, because that will deliver way better customer outcomes. So I would argue that's the stage we're at. I think when I moved over from retail banking, I sort of felt like wealth was slightly a generation behind in tech, in customer outcomes, in the level of innovation. I've seen that change hugely just in the 5 years I've been part of the industry. So I would argue, there you go, we're at the tipping point. And I don't know whether we've got time for questions. I think we have. So happy to take some.
Absolutely. There we go. Thanks, Ruth. So any questions in the room? Time for probably 2. If anyone has any questions.
That beard?
Stunned silence. Yeah, we could do beards.
Yeah.
Do
See, I haven't even
tops.
mentioned your beard.
Can we get the slide back? That'd be great if you don't mind. I feel like I'm a walking advert. Okay, I'm going to ask you a question in that case, if that's okay. So Octopus Money, there's a lot of work around guidance and advice. A lot of firms in this room have advice businesses. What do you think the role of the advisor looks like over the next, say, 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, great question. So I sort of lean on the same experience that I've talked about. So in retail banking, I spent quite a lot of time trying to prove that if you put all of someone's financial information in one place, they do something differently, and it's completely untrue. And if you digitally say, here's everything, now make sensible decisions, I'm going to nudge you towards sensible decisions, people go, this is super boring, and I'm just not interested in stuff you're showing me. Then I moved over to run Octopus Investments and spent an awful lot of time with people like you running advice businesses. And you realize you get these incredibly sticky, trusted, long-term relationships. And you just don't get that in fintech, digital-only businesses in the sort of money planning space that we're talking about. So what I believe is that the person will always have a role. Because I think the person is the only way that you get someone from I'm really confused to I'm comfortable enough to share my goals and aspirations and ask the stupid questions that I feel like I can't ask. And I'm engaged enough that I can get to a plan that is personalized and that understands my situation and critically understands my medium term and my long term goals. I have never seen a digital or AI proposition that can do that, that can build that customer engagement. The bit that I think tech can do more and more of is prepare and deliver the advice. So our model in Octopus Money as an example is we don't use regulated advisors, we use coaches because they plan and they don't recommend, and we deliver all of our advice algorithmically. Now that works for simpler clients. So our clients are generally those with up to 200K of investable assets, the clients that no one else really wants. So we deliver it with a completely different regulatory model where the person does loads of engagement and the advice is delivered algorithmically and the execution is on to settle. So you can keep the cost to serve at a level that means you can serve a 50K client profitably. So, do I see that as a sector that should grow? Absolutely. 92% of people in the UK do not get access to help with their money. When we launch in a workplace, 40% of people sign up for a session, which shows you just how massive the unmet need in the mass market is. And we're increasingly partnering with all sorts of firms like yours to help them figure out how do they create a proposition for smaller clients and how can they do that profitably. But the critical thing, the thing I've proved time and time again, is without a person, you don't get someone through the journey. And now, what does that person do? How highly trained do they have to be? I think we'll continue to see that vary for types of clients. There will always be a role for a chartered financial advisor, and there should be. Can we be a bit more creative with how people are used for different types of clients? Absolutely.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ruth. So question on the left-hand side, if you could just wait for the microphone a second, it's just coming to you from behind. And don't hold it too close to your mouth or you'll sound like you're from a Swedish mouth.
Okay.
Yeah, that's perfect.
It's interesting what you were saying about simple customers and the use of tech. Do you think things like AI could have a use with client-facing solutions for vulnerable customers?
Yeah, I think they absolutely could. I mean, I think the identification and then the adjustment for vulnerability. I think AI can have a role throughout the advice stack, actually. The bit that I don't feel brave enough to do yet is prepare advice using AI, because I think it needs to be auditable. And I don't think, having had lots of questions with the regulator 10 years ago about whether they thought cloud was okay, I'm not going to go into those conversations of is black box advice okay? I don't think we're there yet. Will we ever get there? Who knows? But can AI be used to help you prepare and summarize conversations so that the next person that's talking to someone understands the vulnerability and is able to adjust for it? Absolutely. Just as, OnFido can help you do KYC, there will be all sorts of places where there are point problems that AI is very well placed to solve. I just don't believe it's yet in advice preparation or in customer engagement.
It's a good example with the cloud because there's a lot of regulatory resistance to that, but now it's ubiquitous. You're hard pushed to find any financial institutions not using the cloud. So maybe that's the direction of travel for AI eventually.
Absolutely, I completely agree. But it's interesting, having lived through that, and I did live through it, trying to get a banking license and convince someone that your core banking platform is in the cloud when the regulator's not comfortable with it feels like a marathon, not a sprint. Took them, I would say, 5 or 6 years. to get comfortable that cloud was an opportunity, not a risk. And every time actually I see someone speak, I often ask that question of how will the regulatory framework keep up with AI? I mean, I don't envy that job actually, because I think it's very difficult, but we need to be careful about actually how we as an industry deploy it to make sure that we can deliver in line with Consumer Duty, that we can deliver great customer outcomes, and we can do that predictably. Because I think if not, actually we'll be doing the whole industry a disservice.
Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ruth. We are now out of time, sadly. So if you did have burning questions, feel free to drop me a line and I shall triage them to make sure they're sensible and then have a chat with Ruth. But thank you very much for taking
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Cheers, Ruth.